glad to be here on a much busy weekend for the judiciary and journalists who cover the judiciary. Um, I wanted to start with this case that I was reporting on, and a lot of work that journalists do when reporting about the courtroom is their physical presence in the court, bringing an outside gaze into what's happening or how it's playing out at the courtroom, right? So this was a case involving the rape and murder of a woman. Uh, the stage at which it was being heard in the Supreme Court was a review petition, which means, the whole criminal process has happened. Two levels of appellate jurisdictions looked at these cases, and then finally a review is happening. It's a packed courtroom. The case happened to be from Kerala, so there are a lot of journalists from the Malayalam press, lawyers, judges. In fact, there were a lot of viewers because it was one of those cases where a former Supreme Court judge was also called in to defend his blog post, right? This is the case of Soumya, where the allegation was, or at least how the crime happened was, the legal question really boiled down to this one point, whether she was pushed from the train or whether she fell off trying to defend herself from her attacker. And that would depend, how that question would be answered would be very important for whether the convict would be booked for murder or attempt to murder or just rape. There were a whole bunch of these questions. So in this packed courtroom, a male prosecutor is trying to make his way into the court. Now the presiding judge cracked a joke. He said, Mr. So-and-so, were you pushed into the courtroom, or did someone shove you in, or did you make your way through on your own? In the media gallery with me are the parents of this young girl who's been killed. The entire courtroom starts laughing. There's a huge celebration of this joke, and that's how the proceedings begin. It's not as if the court is unconscious of the gravity of the offense or the fact that it has an impact on real lives, real people. You've read about this girl, her parents are sitting there. But the fact that advocates, even colleagues on the bench of this judge, everyone play into this stereotype for 40 seconds, it sets the tone on how the courtroom is going to look at this issue. Why I highlight this particular instance is, often these are the things that make courtrooms a hostile space for women. Female lawyers in that courtroom or anybody else, what do they take away from what happened in that courtroom that day, right? So part of what the media does, media sab kuch to nahi chalati hai, but talking about things like this will ensure that courtrooms continue to be a safe space, which they should be, right? So, so that brings me to how we talk about women in the judiciary or lawyers, judges. One particular issue that I try to address in my reporting is when we look for experts. Who are the domain experts? More often than not is the men who we see every day. I think for about 3 decades, Falin Hariman, Soli Sorabji, and that list had not changed in how media looks at who are domain experts, who are, the conscience keepers, who are thought of as, somebody who knows what they're talking about, right? It takes a conscious unlearning, identifying the bias, and bringing voices to the table and especially not just when we're looking at, say, a matrimonial case or divorce case, or when we're writing about women's issues only. Like if I'm writing about, say, or like many of Jyoti's stories where she talked about, basic amenities in district court complexes. That's not the only instance where you reach out to a female lawyer or a female judge to talk about their experience. You do reach out to them in an election commission matter, an arbitration matter, a whole bunch of these things, so that then these are also the names that are recognized. Increasingly with the whole senior advocate designation process, the fact that newspaper articles or publications do carry some weight. You saw a whole bunch of lawyers trying to write for newspapers, or not when it mattered, but blogs everywhere. And the space is so crowded by the 4 or 5 names that you already know, the men you already know. And these things do have an impact, because clearly if that is being considered, at the time of designation, women do lose out without access to such spaces. So that is one of the key learnings when how we write about female judges, female lawyers. And more often than not, there's this distinction about saying, let's not call someone a female judge, right? You don't have to, but what happens in the media, unfortunately, is when it's two women sitting and hearing an abortion case, that's when everyone talks about, this is an all-women bench. It doesn't need to be an all-women bench. That's not when you have to highlight it. But the fact that a female judge carries her own experiences. In fact, when Justice Hima Kohli retired from the Supreme Court, the bar has this fairly long practice where they come in the morning and sing praises of the judge, the outgoing judge. So when Justice Hima Kohli was retiring, it was funny to see, because many of them were struggling to find the right adjectives for a female judge. They said, you're very hard, but you also have a soft heart. You're very strict, but you also are so compassionate. So the fact that the balancing is expected out of a female judge, you cannot take that out of, that is contextualized. When that woman judge sits in the court, all of this does play a role. But how you highlight it, how you talk about, my own experience has told me, which is something we corrected after the first story was published, is when we were talking about a fairly bad judgment by a high court judge who happened to be a woman. It's an POCSO case. The initial reportage that went out from our paper also said, she said, right? A lot of quotes that were attributed to the judge, which was from the ruling. She said, she noted. It sort of made it out to very unintentionally, but what it makes is that, you're saying that as a woman, she has a greater responsibility to not say those things. So we immediately corrected it to say the judge said. Because it's not because she's a woman that she probably wrote a bad judgment. It was a bad judgment, period. So these are the unconscious biases that the media should try to correct, which is a constant exercise. These are general practices, good practices, bad practices that the media does. But on a larger level, in the absence of credible information, statistics. In fact, the last panel, someone asked Justice Gupta if there are numbers on how many women are there, and if we have data on this issue. In the absence of credible statistics and numbers, anything flies sometimes. So we have had judges in court say, oh, but women take career breaks, which is why, at 45, when we're looking to elevate, we don't find enough women. These were things that were said in the Supreme Court from observations that flowed from a bench. Part of what the media tries to do is to shed light on this. How many were considered? How many were, filtered at what stage? How many names did the Supreme Court look at it? So why this becomes important is not just from a judicial accountability and transparency point of view, but also to look at larger themes of inclusion. Because at some point, if you looked at a high court, like Rajasthan High Court had its first women judge only a few years ago. So if this is spoken about more often, or if it, every time I write about vacancies in the judiciary, you look at there are only 13 women who are who could even be in the zone of consideration for the Supreme Court, right? How many are chief justices? So only when we write about these things that it makes it apparent to everyone that these are not even considerations that are being made at the level, at the collegium level. The other aspect is also that the collegium system of appointing judges itself, of course, senior designations now are at least application-based, where you see more women applying, but actually making a case for themselves for these issues. But Previously, it wasn't the same thing, right? Like if you had to have a judge ask someone or the court designate someone, it is, again, like Justice Gupta said, these are also from privileged pockets in litigation where you spot these women and, you encourage them to do something like this. So when it comes to the collegium system, many women don't have access to these spaces where, their names are being discussed or they've been seen in court. In that sense, Livra and Bar and Bench have really turned a page because the names of female advocates are seen so much more in reportage regularly now than ever before. So somebody, or when Jenna appears somewhere in the Northeast, there is a mention of that and, that is talked about. But when you just look at how traditional media reports on these issues, these are not conversations that we were having 5 or 6 years ago. So a lot of these questions are also not just limited to reported judgments, but the overall approach to how you look at gendered spaces in the Supreme Court. One big incident, of course, when the sexual harassment incident happened in the Supreme Court involving a former Chief Justice of India, you could see the nature of gendered discourse in popular media, right? Questions about, there was literally no questions asked about the power equation between a sitting Chief Justice of India and a woman who was not allowed to have legal representation before a panel. Woman is referred to as adulteress, even if that is not the point of the case, right? Or how just the allegations against, in a matrimonial case, for example, is recounted in a Supreme Court or a High Court ruling. The trial court might have used certain facts, differently, but when you have a second or a third person recounting what the trial court found, how they are recounted, all of these things seep into reportage invariably, right? It's easy as a journalist to just put it in quotes and say the judge said this and move on. But unless we identify these spots, weak spots in the judgment, because the larger impact of this, of making the law and the judiciary not a safe space, is that, like a lot of young lawyers here think, you will not have a lot of women who would want to venture into these spaces. You sort of alienate them in, the perception is something that this is not for women. And a lot of younger people might not even consider these to be spaces that they want to be in. So the Supreme Court last year came out with a handbook of terms that should not be used. You'd be surprised how many judges were using that so often in context, in courtrooms, even when they make oral observations, right? There are some of these observations which I have reported over the years. For example, a Supreme Court judge who asked, in a case where a minor girl is seeking an abortion in the Supreme Court, the judge says, why do you want an abortion? The lawyer is trying to convince, she's a minor, she does not want to carry the child to term. The judge says, but now that everyone knows about it, can you just carry the child to term and the state can then take care of it? There is an implicit assumption that the press will not report it, or this is conversation for the four walls of the courtroom. But that's not how public courts work. And it is quite insensitive of a judge to ask that question to the lawyer, right? Or if that inquiry has to be made, it has to be made in a certain way. Now with courtrooms being more digital, opening up in your living room, on my TV, on YouTube, there are far more people watching these than ever before. For all you know, that minor girl would also probably be watching the hearings now, as opposed to, say, 3 or 4 years ago. There is a school of thought that these observations of the court should not be reported. That this great tradition of Socratic method where the judge poses these questions and it's all in that line of inquiry and none of that should be reported. But what should be reported is the context. If insensitive things are said in the courtroom, there is a responsibility to put it out there with all the caveats and the context around it. I'm not saying we live tweet it or you sensationalize it, but it has to be told that this is how, the case was being argued in court. For example, one of the cases I always go back to is the Hadia case. If you look at the final product of the Supreme Court, the judgment which we so often go back to, we all remember it as a case that upheld citizens' fundamental right to choose a partner or the right to marry. It's called the right to marry case. But the memory of a journalist or the public memory, what you saw in the newspapers play out, was very, very different. How the court characterized the whole sequence of events in the judgment is an unfaithful telling of what happened in the courtroom. There was this woman in court who was being translated by a senior advocate, and the kind of questions that were put to her included the nature of her relationship with her father. Those were the questions that the bench asked her. But when you look at the judgment or any of the orders that were recorded before, none of it says any of that. It looks as if the journey of the case is that, well, this woman moved the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, here, there is your fundamental right to marry, and now everyone's happy, let's go home. But that's not how it happened. A faithful telling of what happened in the court will add to the debate on how the court looks at these gender issues. It might have been a completely different way the court would have handled if the person who is accused of converting or is accused of being brainwashed was a man and not a young woman there. Or how, I don't know if it was a man, if the judge would have still asked, what is your relationship with your father, right? So these are the things that journalists do. It is, and it's not just an accountability measure, but as a faithful telling of what happens really in courtrooms. Thank you so much.